I studied cultural studies and rhetoric, and so we were looking at the corset is growing in popularity. A corset is an item that was, of course, imposed upon women in Victorian times, or even before, through bodices, and then sort of cast off after, in the 1920s, like women were like, you're not gonna wrap me up in a corset and have me confined to your particular beauty standard. And then the corset started to resurge in the 70s with goth and Madonna, then in the 80s. Wearing it, lots of fashion designers started doing it, and people were wearing just corsets, right, or wearing corsets on the outside. Corsets, of course, are also drawn on typically female-bodied characters in comics and in other places, and then transferred sometimes from this, for cosplay in particular, from the page onto an actual body. And so I was interested in sort of the differences and the different ways that corsets were used in cosplay and in Larp, particularly because people have started wearing or attempting to wear corsets as armor, in particular if they're playing, so the corsets were going from being hyper-feminized and swoony, right, to being like, this is what a warrior wears. But if you actually try to wear a corset for more than a few hours in a Larp where you're trying to draw a bow or do these other things, it's actually now physically confining. So I wanted to say, well, why are so many people wearing corsets in Larps now and in cosplay? And what does a corset mean rhetorically? So as a rhetorical scholar, we look at things as texts. In other words, this material object, right, of a cup is communicating, right, with people in a shorthand sort of way, and potentially is actually, there's a discussion that's happening about it, right, because you're seeing this and you're like, Starbucks, oh, right, this is not cheap coffee, right, she spends $5 a day, and then they have the whole conversation about Starbucks is not good coffee, but it is good coffee, and Starbucks is ubiquitous. I mean, all these things are coming now that you have these associations with Starbucks. So with a corset, you can have the same sort of thing where the person who's wearing it is wanting to communicate a specific thing, but what you are receiving or doing is not necessarily that. And you can play with that tension, right? But you can also, so what's happening is it's being written upon the body, and the corset is also holding in as well as projecting out, if that makes sense. So, so what I did is, let's see, it should tell us. So I did a phenomenological study where I talked to, using an online survey instrument where we had 700 and some folks respond who had worn a corset in a Larp. And I did a qualitative analysis of their narrative answers to look for similarities that would come through, like what are the kinds of concepts or key words or categories that came through. And I looked at costuming theory and previous scholarship on corsets, asked the 5 questions. Out of the 741 responses, 321 were viable and unique, but each one of those had up to 5 answers across, so there's quite a bit of data that's been analyzed here. And so I am going to analyze it based on who took the study, what are the demographics of the people who took the study, what they thought about for choosing to wear the corset, and what does the corset mean in the medium of Larp. Because does it mean something different in Larp than it means if you were to see someone wearing a corset not in a Larp? So the demographics of the response, we had the majority of the people were from the United States, right? At around blue, around 66%. But then the UK was pretty strongly represented there at 14%, and then Canada, Norway, and Sweden, and then other, right? So I had respondents from Belgium, China, Netherlands, Australia, and Turkey, but not very many of them. So it is pretty United States heavy, but it was distributed across. So we did have people from around the world to do. And the United States, predominantly the respondents appear to have come from mostly buffer campaign Larps, because those are more prominent in the United States, but there are some who talked about wearing them in theater Larps and parlor Larps as well. So probably not surprisingly, 84% of respondents identified as female, but we did have gender fluid or non-binary and male respondents. So it was true that corsets were most often worn by women, but can be worn by all genders. Typically, they stated that they were worn to signify female, like a shortcut, real quick, like I'm presenting female. So lots of different types of Larps. Some people talked about weekend longs, Larps of a few hours, and that the type and duration of Larp was something that they considered if they were going to wear a corset. How long am I going to be in this, right? Am I outside? Is it hot, right? All those sorts of things. So these were the 5 questions that I asked. Why do you choose to wear a corset? Or why have you in the past? How do you feel while you're wearing a corset? What factors do you consider when choosing whether or not to wear one? What's the meaning you're trying to give? What are you attempting to try to project when you're wearing it? And then how does the corset help you enact your character, if at all? And so as I went through, we'll just talk about the data and then we'll talk about the theory, right? So I went through the coding of all these answers, some 1,500 answers. Power was one of the things that emerged very strongly. Like feeling powerful or empowered. Gaining status. The corset is a status object. All that's rolled into power. Femininity, probably not surprisingly. Feeling more feminine or conventionally feminine, which was not the same as feeling sexy. Just to clarify that. Sexiness, as you can see, is the 3rd coding category. Sexy, hot, desirable, display or play with sexuality or sensuality. For reasons of comfort or discomfort. Very strongly leaning toward comfort, which may surprise some people, is that a lot of people think about corsets as being uncomfortable, but the people here who are saying that they're wearing them are saying them because they are comfortable and that they give them support, which is the next one, right? And then confidence. A lot of respondents talked about the corsets affecting their confidence level, affecting their posture. I separated attractive and beautiful out from sexiness. If I were to roll sexiness and attractive and beautiful together, like they would be just so much further above than any of the other categories. But some people noted sexiness and said nothing about feeling attractive or beautiful. And some people said they felt beautiful, but not sexy, and some people did say both. And then historical accuracy was another reason to wear it, right? Am I playing in a period Larp? Does it fit? Breathing, which is a type of restriction, but I separated that out because people often think about that. It's one of the very common things that comes up when people think about corsets. Am I going to be able to breathe? Some people want to have the sort of, I can't breathe thing because it helps them with their feeling with their character. Others were wanting to make sure that they could breathe because of very active work. Getting the correct silhouette. So that could be because of clothing, certain types of dresses or things that need to hang a certain way. The corset can help improve the way that the clothing falls on you. And then armor, and then to be in my character. Were all things that came forward from the data. So you can see from here that from the most sexiness was the #1 reason to wear a corset, followed by confidence, followed by comfort. Then posture, femininity, feeling powerful, historically accurate, and armor were the top ones. But of course, sexiness and confidence were both over 40% of respondents saying, that's why I wear a corset. So, in terms of the other considerations that they had, is it appropriate to my character, right? If it was appropriate to the character, even in the slightest, then there would be the choice to typically wear it. Like, they would say, I don't want to wear it if it's not going to fit my character. My character is either lower class, and so she wouldn't have a corset, or this is a historical time period where it really would be an anathema to wear, or an anachronism to wear the corset. But if it's going to fit at all, then these other things like feeling sexy or feeling confident or feeling comfortable, we're going to trump that. Then considering the amount of physical activity that I'm going to be in, how much I need to sit or stand was also something that came out, because sitting is more difficult in the corset. So if you were playing in a situation where you had to stand a lot, then they were feeling more able to wear the corset. Was it accurate to the setting? Physical comfort included things like weather and how well the corset fit, too. Because if it's really, really hot, some people would decide maybe not to wear the corset. If it was planning to be cold, they talked about the corset as an insulating layer. So it was pretty neat that way. But here's corsets as an alibi, right? So a corset is a physical object that creates the alibi of character. And it immediately physically enacts that separation from player to character, right? It's visceral and it's physical. So like when you put the corset on and you lace it up, right, you can feel that it's still there, right? And that feeling of it being there constantly, even though it's going to fade some in your mind, but you can then you move and you're like, oh yeah, there's the corset. And so it's like corset equals character, right? In a lot of ways, like the corset says, I need to remember that I need to speak this way or hold this sort of bearing, and I'm not me. I'm not myself. It changes your body language and your comportment, right? It tends to have your back. So not only does it help support your back, but it puts you in a different posture than you would necessarily be in, which also reinforces character. And can lead then to it can then cause you to change how you interact with others. So if you are here in the corset, and then you were like, I am being a lady, and I'm going to now look down upon you, right? Or I'm going to go, and since it might affect my breathing, it's also going to change how I speak, or those sorts of things. So it actually creates a new body. So I'd like to introduce this theoretical concept, two things. One is the meta-text. So as I talked a little bit about that, so it's a text that's between, right? It's a text that is being a relay switch, And the palimpsest, some of you might know the word palimpsest is used from art, where a painter who usually didn't have enough money to buy more canvases would take a painting that they didn't really like and paint literally over top of the other painting, and so there was the thing underneath. There's the surface painting and the thing underneath. So I'm suggesting that the corset is a palimpsest in that it is presenting one thing with the other underneath in a very physical sort of way, right? So character in corset, player's body behind corset, right? And there's some interesting theory about that comes from uniforms. So, for example, being a cop in a bulletproof vest is much like a corset, right, in this thing. But as soon as you put the uniform of the cop on, the person disappears to an extent and the cop is present, right? Or the military person is present, or the nurse is present, right? Uniform. So looking at uniform theory, corsets do this same sort of thing. And they talk about it, particularly with the military or positions of authority, the business suit, right? These things, is that when they go on, they are encasing or hardening the body in the sense that now I am a figure of authority, right? With this military uniform on and things. And so corsets appear to be doing the same thing in Larps with this encasing, and it's coded almost as a uniform that is saying power, right? So the character's body now exists as a result of the corset. But corsets are the sign of duality, duplicity, right? So corset as an oppressive device, right? It restricts movement, it restricts your breathing, it denotes being a proper female, right? It imposes rules on the person who's wearing it, right? What can I do, right? If you've seen Underworld, the movie with Kate Beckinsale, I don't know, she wears a corset over top of a catsuit, which is a whole nother thing. Let's get that. But she is, one of my favorite scenes in that is like her lover, Michael's been attacked, and it's at the end, and she's trying to lean down to like cradle him and to go, and she can't bend because of the corset, right? And so like she's got one knee up out here like this, and she's trying to struggle down and hold him because she's restricted in the movements there. But also culturally, what does a proper woman do? But then corsets are empowering in that they can be hypersexualizing and draw your attention, but they set this boundary, very physical boundary to do this, like, okay, look, but don't touch, right? So in this they become radical and powerful and transgressive, badass, right? And they do emphasize, that's their point, right? And they do very often emphasize what were hypersexualized areas. That's why they were originally invented. The man was like, let's push up the boobs and make the butt bigger, right? But what's happening if you're using them in cosplay or in Larp is that you have the social contract of the game or the social contract of the cosplay that's saying, I am safe because I am in character, but also we have the social contract of how we're going to interact with each other. And like if I were to do or wear this in public, people will behave differently to me than they will behave in the game, because in the corset it means these things. So for a lot of the women who answered the survey, a lot of the people who answered the survey, it was like, I get to do these things and I'm safe. Like you can, so widely used, they make the player feel empowered, sexy and beautiful. Corsets worn on the outside of the costume denote differently than corsets that are still worn underneath, right? The fact of showing them out is much more empowering. Also, corset, I mean, what people are using corsets for also in costuming is to make an otherwise not exciting outfit look better, right? So it's like I have this sort of plain shirt and plain pair of pants, but if I get this fabulous leather or brocade corset and I put it on top of it, then like now I have a costume. Look at the corset, don't look at how cheap my shirt is. Right? And so we also had a lot of interesting things about one corset is not another corset, right? So you can't necessarily elide all corsets. Leather corsets very much were armor, right? Brocade or lacy corsets were going to denote something different. How well made was the corset? I'd love to do a follow-up study that starts looking at corset policing, because I think it does exist, just like other costume polices have. So, yep, I've kind of went over this. So instead of being a patriarchal control foisted upon women, some people wear them for that reason, because they want to play with that. What did it feel like to be the swooning woman, right? And to not be able to do. And so people talked about using the corset to help them feel smaller or more historical, but in most cases they were moving the other direction. Limitations, I could repeat this. I did have 8 countries. Study indicates that, like the terms queer or nigga, women in particular are reclaiming and defining what the corset means, right? They're like, you guys told me what it meant, now we're going to say what it means. Materiality, I just talked about that, how it was constructed. The over and under bust corsets can potentially have different meanings because of the way they contain. There is also a very interesting waist training movement that is gaining lots of traction. Women that are wearing corsets, not necessarily in Larps and other things, but to get a smaller waist and to reshape their bodies, move their rib cages and things to do. Corsets, particularly as being out of time or out of context, would be another really interesting further study to take a look at, because if you're wearing them for these other reasons. And then this is one of the big takeaways, right? The corset is meant to show that the madam is attractive, but unattainable and even protected from unwanted physical attention, right? And so, which is fascinating. The whole thing was just fascinating. So where are we on time?
We're pretty good.
Okay.
Maybe a minute.
Maybe a minute, okay. Not so much. Because I could go into heavier theory type stuff, but we can also talk about that in questions. So I think that's it then.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It is in fact. That's the reason I was thinking about it. Like it's a restriction and uses
a form of annotation that I don't especially even love. I'm used to APA. It's for my...
For your discipline, yeah.
It's what my discipline uses. And I know it was terrible. I'm sorry. But it is empowering in the sense that it helps make meaning, that it's not exactly uniform, but organizes thoughts in a way that starts to become recognizable as the conference goes on. I'm completely not talking about my own stuff, I'm talking about yours.
Oh,
but
yeah, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, no, that's...
Actually, Jason's project is going to actually have pictures. If you've noticed, mine had 0 pictures.
I come from art education. It's got to have the pictures.
Yeah.
So documenting LARP as an art of experience. There's first couple ones are actually kind of broad, just laying out what the heck that means. And kind of the basic underpinnings. If you look at the picture here, this is actually from a legit gallery show of LARP artifacts, which is why it says Artifact 2015, which was in Israel. Which is when I found out about that while I was working on this, and there were numerous times working on this presentation where I was almost done, and then someone would tell me something really cool, and it would add 2 days to me working on it. And that was one of them. This is an amazing, amazing experience that went on. Some of them I had more familiarity with, like New World Magiscola, which most people recognize as Maury's kind of baby, as the American equivalent to College of Wizardry. You can see me hanging on the back being Chancellor. It's cool times. So, one of the things that I want to talk about is how we understand LARPs to be. They're difficult to document, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's 5 reasons that Stenros and Mamantola identify, which is that they're subjective, so you have numerous personal experiences, that they're co-creative, so they have a certain emerging quality, even if they're fairly tightly scripted, that they're aimed at the first-person audience. A lot of the things that you can catch with a camera are not representative of what it was. The ephemeral, they happen and they're gone, and have a loosely defined purpose. Even when you think as a LARP designer or a writer or even as a player that it means one thing, it can actually change meaning while you're playing, or even later you can look back at it and it has a different meaning than it did when you played it, or a wide variety of things. Also, as Lizzie has pointed out, LARPs can't be relived, and anecdotes gamers tell each other afterward sound like inside jokes to anyone who wasn't there. This is something I'm guessing most everyone in this room has had an experience with. You had to be there. It was amazing. Dude. Any of those variations. Video documentation of LARPs typically portray a linear narrative that focuses on mimetic qualities rather than what it felt like to individuals. They often use this for a commercial. So they're conveying the story of the LARP. And what this is a single strong narrative. And we're like, would you like to be a part of a submarine attacking, I don't know, fairylands, a magical college, a group of artists living in the time of beatniks, what have you? It's easier to talk about a single narrative if, in fact, inaccurate, because it doesn't do a great deal of what I've already covered. So part of this, for me, is separating out whether a LARP is a story or a LARP is an experience. Now, I want to clarify that this is for me. I absolutely believe that there's actually, I've been talking about this recently, as in the past 2 days, so it's legit another thing that could have been in my presentation but isn't, a certain amount of bleed between concepts rather than between experiences. There is narrative elements to LARP, but I don't, in my heart of hearts, feel that LARP is a narrative. Narrative, in just a straight description, is a person telling something to another person for some kind of purpose. And rather than an emergent thing. Life happens, and then afterwards you tell someone what happened in your life, and that is you telling the story of your life. Your life itself was not the story. But they can contain a narrative architecture. I put that term in my paper, and the day after it was due and I turned it in, this meme popped up on a big conversation, which is basically making fun of the term narrative architecture as something that's kind of dated. I figured, whatever, I'm going to own it. I still like the term. Another thing I want to point out, and several people have heard me say this, is that the goal in theater specifically is to have an audience take you as a character or a situation that you're portraying as being a situation. Not necessarily real, but it's exogenous goal. Whereas the goal of a LARP is for you to play the character. You play the character to play the character, that is the goal. Other people taking you as the character certainly facilitates that goal, but it ain't about them. I also want to talk a little bit about embodied experiences. So I'm talking about here as the art form itself being an experience. And Johanna says that LARPs are an art of experience, which is a great phrase. A thing which must be situated in lived experience to be understood. This opens them to being framed as embodied experiences, which is a term Patricia Levy, who's a big art space researcher, has talked about. And these can be used to generate data, provide analysis, but they have a couple of common attributes, that the practitioners are simultaneously the medium and the artwork. You can see this in dance, you can see it in theater, you can see it in LARP. They're different, but they have these connections. They include sensory output and input that mirror social phenomena that intersect with culture, identity, and the flow of power. At this point in this conference, I don't feel like I need to clarify that. They must be experienced to be in existence. That's part of the ephemerality. It's part of the experience. And they exist only as a memory once they are completed. You can see on a picture there from Beat Generation.
What's with the look?
Like, literally, I was putting the last slide in, and then all these pictures come up, and they're like, here's stuff from Beat Generation. And I'm like, God dang it. And it added 2 more days to me putting this presentation together. Because, to talk a moment about this picture, Eric was playing John Cage. Eric had this idea where people could walk in on John Cage doing creative process. And he had been saying a lot when people said, what are you working on? I'm really into water. So he went into the tub and started playing with the water and throwing cards in it and using a bucket and playing with it. And the thing is, he got really into water. And so people walked in and saw him doing it, but he did not notice. Originally, he was doing it as, in fact, a performance because he was helping facilitate the LARP. Eventually, it was not a performance. It was an embodied experience where he was experimenting with John Cage concepts in the persona of John Cage. That was the artistic experience. Other people benefited from it. They splintered off. They had their own perceptions, their own individual journeys, all these unique experiences that are simultaneously linked through the context of the LARP and yet remain individual, valuable, and meaningful. So, this is kind of complex stuff here that I did not give enough time in the presentation because I realized I gave a whole presentation on this concept. In this room, there's actually someone who saw it, which is Anna. Yay, Anna! Because I gave a presentation about ways of framing LARPs as a new epistemology using a rhizomatic structure in Russia. So unless you were in Russia, which in here is Anna, and Yitomas saw it, but he's not here today, you don't already know this stuff. So the difference is this. If you have most games that you've seen, like video game or anything like that, they have a very linear track. Here's the main plot, here's your sub-quest, here's your side quest, blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, there's the great big fight and everyone gets together and hooray, the LARP's over. So there's this one big linear track. A rhizomatic structure sees things as relationships. Certainly there is that plot, but it's not actually linear. It's more like a tangle of different lines. And while that main plot is going on, you have gone off and discovered that another person is related to you, and then you're having a confrontation. Maybe you're sitting silently crying in the corner, and that's incredibly meaningful. And in a lot of presentations of LARP documentation, these are considered secondary. And in my opinion, that is an absolute mistake. Because those are the things that make the LARP meaningful for the individual players. If you want to get a sense of what that experience is, you don't just talk about the big part. If I wanted to talk about what riots are like, I don't just talk about what happened during a riot. If I want to talk about an amazing concert, I can say who was on stage, but what it meant to an individual person, or where they met someone that they care about, or what have you, those are part of what makes it meaningful. Otherwise, you're just listing events. So part of the way that I talk about doing this is thinking about a couple different things. For one thing, the LARP itself is kind of a social object. And then within that, you have things people make. And this is a collaboration in many ways between the context and the player. So the first time I was aware of this was Wands for New World Magiscola, where people spent time, or they bought a thing, or they made a thing, or what have you, and it was invested with meaning, both personal meaning and diegetic meaning, where they got the wand from. And they would bring it in with having put all this thought and time into their wands, or their outfits, or the objects that they made to engage with the LARP. And very few people would ask them about it, but it meant a lot to them. And then after the LARP, I asked one, I was like, I was wondering, does anyone want to talk about their wands? And I had like, the next day, there were like 70 responses with pictures, and it was amazing. And that is one of the things where I started to realize how much those small objects, and apparently, but not actually, small stories started to matter. Another example of this I got from one of the WeirdCon companions, where this LARPer, Quinn D, had chosen to play an artist, not thinking of themselves, in fact, as an artist, and made wire sculptures. And they had both a diegetic effect and an effect outside of the LARP. They weren't always props or even art. Sometimes they were story, experiences, feelings, and they had a life past the limits of the magic circle, where people have them in treasured places in their homes, where people look on them and reflect on the times or the characters or what have you. So the object is not actually defined by what it's made of or media, but the discourse that it generates and is a part of. And these go on. They are, even though the object apparently doesn't change, the meaning is actually an emergent thing that goes on as time goes on, as people change, as the LARP changes, and ends up being referential. So to get a little bit into art theory, I use the terms praxis, poiesis, and aesthesis. These are kind of obscure terms that unless you're really into art theory, you probably don't know. Except for praxis, oddly enough. Everybody knows praxis. Because praxis is creation as an exercise of intent. I meant to do this thing, I have done this thing. Praxis. In the United States, we're real focused on praxis because we love intent. My God. Which is not a bad thing, except if you do it without considering other aspects. Poiesis is a visceral experience of making. So I'm in the moment of 3D printing my wand or carving my wand, or I ordered it from a friend on Etsy or what have you. I see something that's amazing on Pinterest and I recreate it. So that is all invested meaning through those qualities. And aesthesis is a sensorial experience. One has an encounter with an artifact, and these can be multiple things, but as the Chancellor, for instance, I had a ridiculously long wand. It was practically a short sword. It made it hard to sit down, but it felt like a symbol of authority because it was impractical in that sense. There's a point where someone else had broken their wand, and I loaned them mine for half a day. And they're like, "Are you serious?" I'm like, "Yes, of course. You can't study without your wand. Yeah, take one." And they're like, "I'll make you one." I'm like, "All right, that's fine." All right. Another thing about this is when I'm starting to talk about documenting using these objects, I start thinking about it in terms of museums, because I'm an art guy, in terms of how we curate those. I brought this up with a friend, actually Evan Torner, and there is an older concept of museum as a tome in which artifacts go to die. Let's see, they are entombed for all times, and they're just be safe, locked up in a mausoleum of meaning that is lost. That is an older concept of museums that is sadly still prevalent in some museums, not all of them. But newer museums are actually more keen on being participatory, where they want people that are there to engage with objects as cultural participants, not as people just consuming work that is shoved in their face. A recognition that meaning can change over time. So there's even, I note here the interactive experience model, which one of the things that's going on here is that the museums are increasingly thinking about experience design in engaging with them. So what I am suggesting in part, and I think I come back to this in a moment, is that when you are working to document objects, it makes the most sense to present them in a way that is itself an experience. Is an experience that is separate but related to the Larps that we're talking about. So you have to think about the experience of the person who's engaging with it. Man, this is so much stuff. I'm gonna have to speed myself up a little. So that I have time to talk about everything, I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. So there's different ways that this has been done. If you haven't read Nordic Larp, you should. It's an awesome book. But when they're doing things, they do collect participant data in terms of narratives, but they're focusing on the creator and kind of that large subject that I'm talking about, which is fine. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with the linear model, but it foregrounds a different kind of understanding. If I'm trying to understand what the experience was like, I kind of want to get a little bit more broad. Awesome book, tells you a lot about a wide range of Larps, gives you a lot of insight, and the work that I'm doing here could not exist without them. But I'm suggesting a different kind of format. Another example is, so here I call it artifact collection as reflection. The Larp is over, we're looking back, this is kind of what it was. This one here, I'm talking about art as a mechanic in a Larp. For instance, there's Beat Generation, where people were creating art as a part of it. Even people who did not consider themselves to be artists were making kind of inspired art and then sticking it up to the wall. And above that, you can see there's a ritual-based Larp called This Miracle, where part of what you did was made objects that were going to be important for religion. So these are artifacts that are made as a part of the Larp. They're made with whatever the organizer has brought. They're treated with complete sincerity. They're significant to the game in many ways. How these are preserved afterwards, what they mean coming in, they're a little bit different. So let's go through here. And then I've got formal exhibitions of Larp artifacts. So my two examples here are, one, the museum show I talked about before, which was in Israel. It sounds like a great show. It now exists only in photos. Slight problem in the sense that because it's in a physical space, you had to be able to travel there to see it. And also, it's more practical if you're in a relatively small country, where you can get a whole lot of objects, rather than a very large country, where that's kind of a hard thing to do. It's hard to travel there, it's hard to collect the objects. And another example here I have is Janea's work, which is she collects objects for her autoethnography. Stuff she's given, stuff she made, she makes Pinterest boards, she puts together music, and she uses all of these as a tool to encompass her personal experience. It's very similar to what I'm talking about, but very focused on one person at a time because it's autoethnography rather than presenting multiple perspectives to an audience. The last example is my first attempt to try and do something like what I'm talking about. It is, I will say, imperfect, but by God, I tried. So I collected different artifacts from people who played New World Magiscola. They volunteered them to me, I put up a submission sheet, I photoshopped them so that they would fit within a frame, I collected all the information that goes on them, I built it on a Wix site from scrap, but I should have used Omeka, it turns out, which I hadn't heard of at that point. And it has a lot of information. It's got some limitations, the chief one being that I curate it and have complete power over it. There's no space for discourse. There's also nothing that causes a viewer to want to invest themselves. So it ends up being a little bit like a wiki. You know, there's a resource there if you want it, but it's not something you're going to go to like, say, you would Imgur, to throw a name out there. Imgur is a visual discourse. That is what Imgur is. It requires moderation, which I was uncomfortable doing at that point because I'm like, I have no time. But it is required to have the investment necessary to make this a living exhibition if you're going to be online. My conclusion here is real small. Also, I love that typewriter. Main point, collections of player artifacts, effective documentation of Larps as an art of experience. My feeling is the best way to represent Larps as experiences is to consider the participant experience of the documentation itself, focusing on them as co-creators. We have a tendency to kind of think of the designer as the primary visionary, the auteur, such like, I feel like when we do that, we give short shrift to the players and the dedication, the involvement, the energy, the thought that they have put into things. I touch here on praxis, poesis, and aesthesis because they support different applications of the research. There's more than one way to document a LARP. There's more than one way to present that documentation. It's difficult to gauge best practices for this because, frankly, there aren't that many exhibitions of LARP artifacts. There's Facebook. People put up a lot of pictures on Facebook. There's websites, which most of the time end up being commercials. Formal presentations is something we haven't done much of, but I think that we should. I hope it's a significant study as a starting of the conversation. I hope I'm not alone in it. And I'm still looking at other ways of doing this. It's probably still going to be web-based because the United States is a big place and I would rather it was international. So a physical collection is for my purposes, not as practical. And I also want to create a higher degree of community investment. And that is me.
About 10 minutes for questions and discussion. If you guys, yeah, let's just jump around.
Okay, it's about the corsets and the kind of the implications of what it's saying about how a woman feels comfortable dressing up in something which empowers her in a LARP or in a cosplay, but then she says she won't wear it in. It's almost like she doesn't feel the right to feel empowered in public, and also kind of how that empowerment does that empowerment come through kind of roots of inheritance, which is something that I talk about in my own research from Alfred North Whitehead, but so roots of inheritance drawn from burlesque and DOMs, D-O-M-M-E, which are kind of transgressive performances or role plays, and therefore they're seen as something you can't present in public because they are transgressive performances rather than real life.
Oh, I would argue, in fact, in the actual paper, there's definitely some theory and stuff that pulls from both burlesque and dom culture because it is a performance, but it's the alibi, and the issue here that's happening is for women to feel sexy and empowered actually is in dominant outside society or patriarchal society is repressed a lot, right? Also, there's genuine fear by women of being hypersexualized and then being assaulted. So being inside this alibi of play, either a burlesque show or kink or LARP or cosplay, the women, the people wearing corsets are feeling then that they can showcase that part of themselves or do that sort of performance and have these sort of boundaries of safety that don't exist in regular life. With that.
I have something to tell Jason about documenting LARPs. Last year we had a LARP that was designed like a book LARP. I mean, we were playing like in a cottage, but the mechanics was that you get a piece of text which has like some narrative things for you to do, but if you fulfill it, you have a lot of space to interpret what to do, but then when you fulfill it, you come to a special location where you write the text how it went on, and the next player who gets to this location having the same hashtags gets your text, and that is the part of his life now, and he interprets it. And then he goes further and writes another text. So we get several lines of text which you can follow through the hashtags or through the like character line of one person who lived through this Larp, or otherwise following like what was the way of this particular piece of text through the Larp. And this is like a hypertext that we have now, so that you can like have a bigger expression than normally you do about what's going on in the Larp. But that was a Larp designed especially for those who like to create texts and who are like a bit writers who are not against doing this. Though the texts they produced were like, I don't know, 10 lines or maybe 15 lines. They are very profound and they are very emotional, and we are designing the website now for people to get acquainted with this, and maybe we'll restage this Larp, though it is really very difficult, but I look forward for it because it will be like another book, because even if you have the same like clans of people acting there, and the world is more or less the same, it will be totally the other story and bunch of stories.
Thanks.
I think we have another one.
Another question?
Oh, I was just gonna throw my things on the ground. Just like elaborate on like burlesque theory. I'm a performer, and so like corset and like clothing removal theory. The removal of a corset is something that's like debated pretty heavily because of like when, where, and why, and that's something that's thought a lot about in burlesque, like especially as a fat performer. The removal of a corset can be very powerful because a lot more falls out when you take it off. And so it becomes like a body positive aspect as well to go from something that is contained, typically, especially like a tummy being concealed and thought to be something that should be concealed, to something that is then presented is something that's considered pretty powerful.
You know, I was thinking on the idea of removal. So one of the things I've been thinking about is other expressions of sexuality, gender, what have you. And one of the things I was thinking about was John Delancey, who played Q on Star Trek Next Generation. So he has this thing where when he plays a character, he does some kind of ritual, he eats a muffin, what have you, that is always for that character. So when he played Q, he decided right at the start that Q does not wear underpants. So in that sense, I was like, the absence of that garment affects how he plays and how he thinks about that character. And I think it's as interesting in many ways to explore absence as presence. Anyway.
We have a couple more minutes if anyone else has another question. Otherwise, I think these guys could just talk to each
That's
other.
it. I have another.
That
I
was
completely. There's something else that came up in conversation. First of all, I left out my own research where I had people like make reflective artworks at the end of the stuff, and we would bring them in and discuss them before the next session, and that's very productive. But I also, while I've been here at the conference, I started talking about fan art, which is weird, right? People make fan art of you after you finish a Larp, or even the discussion that happens online. Like you can have artifacts that exist outside the diegetic space of the Larp that are nevertheless connected to it and provide another perspective. You can write stories about what happened to your character after the end of the Larp, and that is as valid an artifact as something that was made before or during, in terms of providing more perspectives. And to me, those are just fascinating artifacts.
I actively journaled during a Larp, and it was like profound to do that for a whole weekend. Like immersive. Yeah, she's very interesting. Yeah, we'll go back and then.
Oh, no, you go first.
I'm curious if you have any sense of this, Maury, of if the corset in this role-playing experience, if it's putting it on and lacing it up, is that part of the experience as well, or is that sort of kept separate? So is that off stage, as it were?
Well, it happens on site at the Larp, but it doesn't happen that other people see. Although one of the things that people commented about in the Butono is that and most corsets require
Yeah.
another person to help you get in and out of the corset, and so there is a bit of a ritualistic aspect that happens of putting the corset on, because you do have to very often identify who's going to help you, right, with that. And it can become an interesting social place. That's similar but different to the Victorian women that would, require servants or whatever to help get them into the thing. But so yes, because there was also considerations of, little things like using the back room, right, and other sorts of things because you're wearing it for long periods of time. Yeah. The old boots before corset sort of thing too, right? Because after you're laced in, you can't do. But being able, so there was the I'm empowered and I'm out here, but now wait, I need to go find somebody else to help me get undressed so that I can do. But there became a bit of community around corsets and corset wearing, because you could, there are folks who know how to lace a corset, and then there are folks who don't touch my corset, right? And so becomes a sub-crowd inside. So when I was really looking at, there's so much more I could do with this data, because there was really looking at the fit of a corset, and people talking about buying a corset online and it's not really a corset that fits your body well, and then you put that on and then you have specific feelings about that versus somebody who makes a proper corset, and how much bend there should be and how it should feel. Women, in particular, women talking to women, but also women talking to people of all genders who are now wearing corsets, and this is if we had men who were wearing corsets. Complete, I don't have any cultural knowledge in for wearing a corset, and so we're getting this discourse of people sharing that, and it really also is a lot of gender play that was happening, but also men and non-women were talking indeed also about that sense of power that was not necessarily associated with femininity. But which I think leads a little bit more into some of the Dom theory that comes through, because there's also this sense of course, watching, right? Other people wanting to look at people wearing a corset, and imagining also that feeling of restraint and power that's simultaneously happening. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
We're stretching time a little bit, but last question?
Oh, how much are we stretching? Are we over?
It is 12:18.
And it's until 12?
12:15, I think.
No, it's
The thing is 12:30.
I
We've got 12 minutes to talk.
Do we have
Hi,
12:30 or do we have a 15-minute break?
I don't
No,
know.
it's 12:30.
I don't want
It's
to,
lunch,
okay.
it's lunch after this.
Yep.
It says,
Yeah, it's still 12:30.
All
I think
right.
I would know these things since I know.
Yeah,
I just wanted to posit to Jason's brain the concept of the artifact as totem or as fetish. Because I think that for me, I've been thinking a lot about the way that we imbue energy into these objects and then use them later in other contexts in our lives. So anyway, yeah. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to also, like, you don't have to come up with these now. But I played Playdate when I was here, and I took everyone's artifacts, and then someone else is like, I want those when you're done, because I collect ephemera.
Yeah.
So people are collecting them for their personal things. But it was an interesting experience of having us pretend to be 5- and 6-year-old kids and doing, like, here's the soup princess that I drew in character for Sharon, who is my little whiny brother. And it's interesting because normally, these are done, recycle them. But they have a preciousness and a meaning to them that isn't always immediately clear. And again, in terms of totem, in terms of taking things and going forward, like, there's a reason that some people will not reuse some costume items. I can't wear that, it belongs to la 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 la. And I'm like, yeah, you could.
That's half my closet.
Yeah.
She also
So,
can't throw their
People
stuff.
talked about that with the corsets as well, as they were like, this corset was
That's
this character, and so I'm going to put another thing, I need to buy another corset, or I need to do a thing. And also fetish is very much a discourse around, corsets are very fetishized.
Well, and I don't just mean sexual fetish. I
No,
mean
I know,
the-
yeah.
And as a complete side thing, because no one's raising their hands with questions, I want to talk again about my deep and abiding love for beat generation. So Maury sent me a copy of her design document, which she made look like it was banged out on an old typewriter. And the fact that she did that, and it changed the experience of even reading it in advance, was a thing I loved. And it was written in a voice that was it explained what the beats were trying to do while also being like in voice, but also not making fun, but also understandable. And just as a quality document, there was that. And then during the LARP, like I said, people made art and they put it on the wall and they took pictures of it, but also some people brought their own old typewriters and some people brought old cameras and took pictures. And the cameras that they brought are a kind of LARP artifact, and the pictures they produced are an artifact. The theoretically inferior quality of the documentation ends up being a superior artifact for the experience. I'm on.
No,
Yes. Once again, sorry. Concerning artifacts, I think it often happens that like one object has been used by many LARPers for the same purpose. Say, this is the King Arthur sword that I played with, you played with, and he will play with, and this is the community artifact. Yeah, that's a great thing to think about. And what we did once, it was that we took some artifacts that were significant to many people, and we put them into a LARP, and it was like a memory room inside the Elvish kingdom. And we made, we recorded stories that were in-game stories about these artifacts, and the one who came, he could touch this object and he could hear in his headphones the story of this object, but it was like an in-game story connected with the stories what was going on in-game, and that gave a lot of inspiration. And moreover, as a human, as a LARPer, you have those contexts that you know that probably you've been using this particular object in the other game or somehow, so this was like multi-level play inside the LARP, and that was really very interesting and great.
I think there's another interesting spillover which is between real life and LARP. So when we played Say a Little Prayer, someone gave me a shawl, because in a previous game they saw how a shawl could, even a simple costume could make a thing, and I was playing a drag queen, which incidentally, while in that LARP I felt like a thing of beauty, and people treated me like one, and they said that they saw me as a thing of beauty. I am positive that a picture would show a great big fat man wearing a shawl. So it's one of those things where I know the picture would not have captured the experience. But within the context of the game, it was a veil, it was a cap. At one point I was dead drunk and I put it over my head as a blanket. But it was also an item that was given freely and with a certain amount of love by someone else that they use in their everyday because of another experience. So that goes back to like a kind of shifting meaning of the artifacts, but also in terms of it can be one thing for one person, another thing for another. There's a certain communal nature to it that I think you're highlighting. That is, there are very particular artifacts that get used that way, but certainly meaningful.
We can talk about, sorry, question here.
I have sort of two things, and they're in different tracks. One is around the idea of non-physical artifacts. I don't know if you've done thinking on that, but like character playlists, for example. And I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts around that.
It's, yes, I have. They're harder for me to engage with just because it's not my background. Someone asked me about music, and that's, again, to cite Kemper. One of the things she does is develop playlists for her characters. And I know many people who, before they go in, will, this is my character's theme song. And in fact, in New World Magiscola, like repeatedly people say they will ask for that kind of thing. And those are another thing where I absolutely think that they are great representations of LARPs, even if they're not even directly from it. Like afterwards, this is a song that...
The experience for the Beat Generation LARP, the design document was done in the voice of and in the style of jazz poetry and using the language that were popular at the time. So when I'm asking you to do some of these things, I'm saying, dig it, go, blow man, blow, right? You know, these things that are within the design document, and I'm bringing in pictures to evoke those things, and then the artifacts. I have physical books of the people that were there, including some that were from the right 1963, you know, and the things. But the process was creating something that would be a tangible thing that they could hold, but that gave them direction to create something like what was in what they were holding. So a lot of what's in the design document for Beat Generation are essentially artistic prompts, if that makes sense. So it's like you can cut up stuff and rearrange it and see what that does. Turn the picture upside down and see what it says. Draw your partner's face, right? Do those things, but they're written as. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I
So-
think oh, you finish.
Yeah, no, I just was gonna, the process for creating that was very similar to creating fiction, as opposed to writing a design document.
I was going to say one important differentiation, even though it felt like a beat document, is that I know that Maury sought feedback because I gave her feedback in terms of things that I
As
thought were.
opposed to first thought, best thought for the beats.
Yeah, because if it's beat, it's like you do it and it's done and it's out there in the world. But in this case, like I gave feedback, I said what I thought was problematic, I suggested some additional games, she went and did additional research and refined it. So it is intentionally not actually beat, while still drawing on much of the reservoir of creativity of that time and place.
And music was a big part, too.
Please.
This ties into what you're talking about, but I've been thinking a lot of artifacts for reflection, and that being an integral process, part of the process of debriefing and of transitioning and of making meaning. In the Larp that we made, Epiphany, which is a Mage the Ascension-based Larp, Nordic Larp, where we were playing essentially ourselves as just, slightly enhanced, can affect magic with, our minds, all that. And people were playing with their real world experiences, their real world traumas, their real world belief systems. And so I thought that it would be important, and I really wonder if this is not just for Bleed, but in general, important to have a reflection hour where they would actually create an artifact. So I had a bunch of art supplies, and they could imbue that artifact. And this was during the process. This is after they'd already done their epilogue, so they were technically de-rolled. But it's still, after a weekend long, it takes a while, right? And giving just an hour of quiet time to either go take a walk or to make this artifact that you could then take with you, that would be something that you imbue with meaning, that then becomes, something that you can choose to do with whatever you want in your day-to life. I ended up making just a tiny little charm bracelet that I ended up wearing for a couple of months to remind me of the epiphany that I had in the game. And I also think about these post-Larp stories that people create about their, characters' experiences as being really central to that debriefing process. So one thing that I would really encourage is not just to memorialize, but also to be part of the ongoing process of the experience, and to really, and also photographs, to be able to make real something that is ephemeral and that can feel like a dream, or feel like it's not important or valid, or even feel completely alienating once you're back into real life and you're like, did that really happen? Does anybody really, people can feel really validated by those ephemera.
When you make a piece at the end, you are literally constructing meaning of the experience. I touched on this also in terms of my research. What I would do, because we were doing an emergent plot, in between, people would make stuff at home. And most of the people I was working with had knowledge of the arts, actually all of them. And when they brought it in, we would do what I called a pre-brief, where we both talked about what happened last time, but people would show their objects. So much of what I did was collaborative that my players got a little sick of it. And they really valued sharing that object, because this was a time when it was all about them and their experience and what they saw and the meaning that they had made as individuals. So they really love the heck out of the pre-brief. And I think that goes back to the making of meaning process that they went through. So especially even in, because normally we're talking about short forms and a lot of blockbusters, but especially I would say in long form, there is absolute value to that.
We are. Thank you guys so much. You're a wonderful audience, and thanks for the presenters.